recording this. We had some folks who weren't able to attend, so we will record this for those who can't attend tonight. Thank you all for coming. This is the Magnolia United Church of Christ Learning Forum, and as we head into the summer, we thought it would be apropos to spend some time thinking about coexistence with the beautiful creation that surrounds us. So tonight, we are very fortunate to welcome Kurt Hellman from Conservation Northwest. Kurt is the Senior Coordinator of the Wildlife Recreation Coexistence Program for Conservation Northwest. And part of that work is to grow coexistence between wildlife and outdoor recreation across Washington State. So Kurt's going to speak tonight for a bit, and then we'll have some Q&A. Because we have a small group, we might not go the full amount of time, so we'll go until we don't. If you have questions that come up during the time, please go ahead and drop them in the chat, and I'll turn it over to you, Kurt.
Awesome. Thanks, Marcy. And thanks to Anna, who I don't believe is on the call but yet. But yeah, I just want to say thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to talk about Conservation Northwest in the breadth of our work, but specifically my expertise, as Marcy mentioned, is balancing recreation with conservation, specifically wildlife conservation, all across public lands in Washington State. So I'll just take a moment just to get my technological ducks in order. Go. Are we able to see my screen here?
We can, yep.
Awesome, great. Okay, great. So I'm here to talk about kind of a new type of science and its application to public lands and recreation in Washington. And I'll be sharing a bit of research from a recent report that we compiled that basically gets at what does the science say about how wildlife and outdoor recreationists interact here in Washington. In short, it's complicated, but I'm here to kind of give the 10,000-foot level of what the science says and what does that mean from a land management perspective, and then what does that ultimately mean for you and for me who enjoy outdoor recreation, whether that's hiking, whether that's mountain biking, rock climbing, sailing, and we can kind of go from there. So just maybe before I dive into the science, I want to just take a moment to talk about Conservation Northwest. I've been on their staff for just about 2 years now, and Conservation Northwest has been around for over 35 years, operating all across Washington State. We were based in Bellingham for the first few years of our existence, but have now been operating out of Seattle more recently. But some of the big stuff we've been working on include transporting Canada lynx from British Columbia to northeastern and north central Washington, trying to reintroduce and restore those fairly delicate populations of Canada lynx. We've also done lots of different fisher releases all across the state as well, which is a pretty unique and fun house-sized weasel. That's a really fun carnivore in our forest that's coming back and rebounding. And this little graphic here, this map just shows different animals and grizzly bears in the North Cascades, wolves across eastern and now hopefully central and southwestern Washington State. So there's quite a breadth of work that we do, but we've certainly been leaning and expanding into the recreation sphere since recreation has been growing and growing and growing in Washington. And with outdoor recreation, there's certainly a lot of land in Washington in which we can recreate. Here in Washington, we have about 20 million acres of public lands that's managed by a concoction of different federal land managers like the U.S. Forest Service, like the National Park Service. And then we have a lot of different state managers as well. I'm thinking of Washington State Parks, Washington DNR, and Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And then on top of that, there's local land managers as well that operate perhaps on a county or even smaller or city basis. And then on top of that too, we have 6 million acres of tribal land here in Washington. We have just about, I believe, 29 or 30 federally recognized tribes, and then more in addition to that in Washington State. So the point here is that there's lots of different land in which y'all and me and you can recreate in. And just maybe a further context about myself, I certainly love getting outside however I can every weekend. And so I'm certainly living as well as working in this recreation space on public lands. And then just maybe a little bit more context to outdoor recreation and why conservation groups are more engaged in recreation in general. We just have more people more than ever before. You know, we're getting pretty close to 8 million folks here in Washington. And you might have guessed it, a lot of those folks are in the Western Cascades or the west side of that mountain divide. And we are seeing just a growing interest in recreation across the board, and state lands and federal lands, as well as local lands. Just from 2019 to 2020, we saw that huge increase of about 12% of visitations increased on state lands. But, you know, this really has been a trend that's been going a lot longer since COVID-19. Over, you know, many decades, we've seen a steady increase for the amount of folks that are engaged in outdoor recreation, which is a fantastic thing, by the way. And just maybe one quick note, just particularly in the last almost 2 decades, it's like the camping has been really huge on U.S. Forest Service lands. It's increased by nearly 100% in terms of reservations. And so, you know, the outdoor recreation certainly isn't going anywhere anytime soon other than up. And so with that said, there is, you know, some data to show, like, what does that mean necessarily for our public lands and the wild critters that are there in the wildlife habitat that encompasses a lot of public lands. And so this is just a little bit more data just to get the point across that there's certainly been an increasing trend over many decades of recreation use, but particularly in 2019, we saw a huge jump. And this graph here just shows across the nation on Forest Service lands, the increase, that huge jump in recreation use. And so it definitely has some conservation, wildlife conservation implications, but it also has some implications for how do we manage our lands better to accommodate all these other people that are on our lands. And so certainly many questions have been asked and wrestled with over the last, I guess, 4 years now. And then just to bring an element of the economic and health value to Washington specifically, outdoor recreation and the expenditures, whether that's in the tourism industry or more directly related, like outdoor recreation, commercial value, it's been growing a ton. I believe in 2020, Earth Economics did a study that we're over 3% of our state GDP in terms of outdoor recreation. So it's super critical to our economy here in Washington. And we equip just about over a 250,000 folks here in Washington as in employment. And, you know, I think some of us here can point to outdoor recreation as our jumping point to stewardship or to advocacy for conservation. And so I think recreation just for a lot of us here in Washington is tremendously important. And so all of these questions and data and research that's been coming out about increasing recreation use prompted us to team up with a group of scientists based in the Methow Valley in north central Washington called Home Range Wildlife Research. And we collected all the science we could through the lens of 15 Washington-specific wildlife species, and specifically finding the research that notates how do these animals interact with wildlife? What is their relationship exactly? Is it negative? Is it positive? And what are the complexities within that? And this report was influenced by a variety of different folks. We've had tons of conversations since 2019 with different tribal nations here in Washington state that have been talking about concerns related to recreation for a number of years. We've been talking with other recreation groups that have concerns about accommodating all the new people out on our public lands. And so anyway, this was definitely a collaborative effort to really consolidate all of this scattered and far-reaching and new research on the topic of wildlife and recreation. And so just to kind of, as a footholder and to know where we are in our presentation today, I just am breaking up our presentation in 3 different sections. One is the overview, kind of 10,000-foot view of the science of how does recreation affect wildlife and vice versa. And then secondly, we'll go into species accounts, kind of get into the nitty-gritties with carnivore or ungulates or with avian species. And then we'll talk about broad implications. What does this mean for Washington State going forward? And what does this mean for you and I? So 10,000 foot level, we have, you know, a lot of this science is new. As I mentioned before, the majority of the science that we compiled, and maybe just a note, we compiled well over 100 different pieces of peer-reviewed literature, as well as scholarly articles here and there to kind of add to this report, which is well over 200 pages. But happy to share that, like, most of the research indicates that recreation tends to have a negative impact on recreation, and a lot of that is consolidated in the idea that humans displace or disturb wildlife when we're in closer proximity. But of course, you know, we'd love to know to what extent does that actually affect wildlife in the long term. So a lot of the literature that we compile notates and observes short-term behavioral responses. That includes, you know, fleeing a certain habitat area where they once previously were, or feeling an increase in the physiological stress, given that there's a human around that previously wasn't there. And so while we do have a lot of short-term and narrowly focused responses about wildlife in regard to increased human presence through recreation, it's pretty hard to demonstrate the community or population levels to entire wildlife species. So another way to say that is the accumulative effect of these short-term behavioral responses is still yet to be determined, but we certainly have some clues and pretty big indicators for what this could mean on a grander, larger scale. So I have a quick graphic here just to kind of walk through this with y'all. So we have some short-term behavioral responses, and I'm sure most of us here can relate to this through personal experience. So let's say, for instance, we're walking on a hiking trail and we come across a deer or any other type of wildlife. That deer tends to do what? More often than not, flee or go to a different part of public lands. And so this immediate or instantaneous impact can often mean, you know, lost foraging opportunities for that particular deer or any other wildlife species, and an increased stress response from that particular animal. So those are more of the minute and short-term behavioral impacts that recreation can have on a particular animal. But as I noted before, it's a little bit harder to parse out specific impacts to the survival of an individual animal across its lifetime, or how it influences the reproductive success of an entire population. And so kind of just extrapolating to the longer term, we have lots of people out on our public lands. We certainly have lots of wildlife in our forests. I think Washington State is still teeming with diverse flora and fauna, which is awesome, but we still don't really know the accumulative effect and accumulative impact to the wide breadth of wildlife in the state. So and furthermore, as we dug into the research and specific papers noting short-term behavioral changes, it's that kind of at the end of the day, these short-term or minute impacts are very context dependent. They vary due to the context of specific habitat or the specific biome. And then on the recreation activity side, different types of recreation activity affect wildlife differently. So the intensity of recreation in an area, whether it's a really popular trail or not too popular trail, can impact the output of a wildlife impact from recreation, as well as the timing, the season of the recreation occurrence, and the overall geographic footprint can all affect this kind of short-term behavioral response. And you know, at the end of the day, this kind of necessitates a further investigation more often than not at the local scale, given that a lot of variables that affect this dynamic between wildlife and recreation happen on a local contextual scale. And so I just kind of put some pictures up again of the different species that we covered. And again, this was about 15 different species. including carnivores, our ungulates, which are our hooved mammals, as well as some birds in the state. And then maybe at the 9,000 or 8,000 foot level, as I like to say, we found a little bit more nuanced trends regarding this relationship, this complex relationship between wildlife and outdoor recreation. So within this kind of short-term behavioral change, we've noticed that animals tend to have a stronger response to less predictable forms of recreation. That predictability aspect I'll talk a little bit more about, but real quick, unpredictable recreation can look like a number of things, but mostly like off-trail travel or off-road travel. Reproductive status is super important. Pregnant females or young tend to be more vulnerable to instantaneous disturbance or displacement from outdoor recreation. Seasonality is also important. Responses between wildlife species can differ between summer and winter. And winter, for a lot of our ungulate species especially, is I like to say, a calorically scarce time for those particular animals like deer and elk. They have it pretty rough, and sometimes even slight disturbances can mean a drastic impact to their well-being. And then moving along, habitat generalists generally fare better than habitat specialists when it comes to recreation impacts. And then we have also seen some species are flexible in terms of their behavior. They can flex their activity times to shift more nocturnally to avoid different human impacts. And then generally speaking, as the intensity of recreation increases, so does the impact to wildlife in that particular area. And then I've mentioned this before, but it's worth saying again that the different types of recreation have different impacts. And there's some differences and differentials between mountain biking versus hiking, motorized versus non-motorized. But at the end of the day, it's the sheer accumulation of recreation that we have in our public lands that poses the most concerning element for conservation moving forward. Okay, so now to kind of hop into more of the species-specific information as it relates to wildlife. And I went ahead and just put up a little graph of the species that we covered and their corresponding conservation status, I guess, and concern from a conservation standpoint. So we have bighorn sheep, caribou, mountain caribou, which actually have been extirpated here in Washington as recently as 2018. Then we have elk and mountain goat, mule deer, and then rounding out our carnivores, we have black bear, grizzly bear, Canada lynx, mountain lion, wolf, and wolverine, which is a personal favorite of mine. And then looking to our avian species, we have the golden and bald eagle, marbled murrelet, and the sage grouse. All with, as you can see, varying amounts of concern in terms of conservation. So let's dive into the ungulate themes and looking at how the science tells us that recreation relates to ungulates' well-being on public lands. So we know that ungulates can sometimes be habitat specialists, meaning that they need a set of specific criteria for their habitat in order to do well. But they use a large range of habitats, sometimes shifting to different areas in the summer versus winter. And so these wintering areas are really, really important to the lifespan of a particular ungulate, regardless of the species. And on top of that, fawning and calving seasons for species is a vulnerable time of year and needs to be taken into account in terms of recreation management. And then hopping right along into carnivore themes. So a lot of species have elements of denning or hibernation, particularly for bears. And then they rear young in a pretty slow manner. And those are very vulnerable times for these species in terms of impact from recreation. And a reason for that is that a lot of these species are pretty wide ranging. Take the wolverine, for example. A male wolverine will sometimes have a territory that can span hundreds or upwards of 100 square miles. And the grizzly bear is kind of similar, but more on the tens of square miles in terms of territory. And so they can roam tons and tons of area on public lands and beyond, and generally require time and space away from humans to do pretty well. But with that said, a lot of our carnivores can demonstrate a flexibility for behavior. For instance, the mountain lion is more of a nocturnal animal that can basically stay away from humans during their most important times within the 24-hour cycle and be more active at night and not face any or too much human disturbance. And then this is just a repeat of that 8,000-foot level of recreation impacts on wildlife and what the literature tells us. And I just wanted to put this up here again to kind of reiterate how kind of the trends and themes from particular animals kind of resonate with this list of trends found in the literature. We talked about the predictability of recreation, the reproductive status, and seasonality is pretty important in terms of context of recreation impacts to wildlife. And so moving right along, we'll talk about broad implications and kind of what does this mean for land management and recreation management in Washington going forward, and then get to more personal implications here. So this is a map kind of notating all the different public land here in Washington. So based on the literature, our report made recommendations for land management moving forward to better wildlife and recreation coexistence. And so step one, we recommend that land management in the state of Washington identify the overlap between wildlife habitat, and particularly critical wildlife habitat, and popular recreation areas. We feel that first identifying that overlap would be a great way to promote and implement coexistence practices to reduce impacts to wildlife. And two, this is a pretty big one, but an important one nonetheless. It speaks to the idea that we currently don't have a lot of great information for when animals will have a recreation use threshold in which they will not inhabit a certain area. Another way of putting that is that animals might have a threshold in which they can handle human presence in terms of numbers and volume of visitation in any particular area. So that necessitates the better data collection at our trailheads and our recreation lands, just understanding how many people are in certain areas in our wild landscapes. That can be a great way to pair our recreation data with potentially thresholds at which we can hopefully identify in the future that animals can handle any disturbance or displacement from recreation. And three, this is a big one. It's protecting spatial and temporal refugia. Another way of putting that is that animals, at the end of the day, need time and space away from humans. And some areas are a little bit more valuable than others for certain species. And that might look different for the whole gambit of species here in Washington. As I mentioned before, we have a whole diverse species spectrum in our forests. And so, protecting those critical areas and critical times of year for species can be a really, really great way to get at this coexistence between wildlife and recreation. And then four, we recommend that land managers implement adaptive management actions, meaning that given that the status quo has changed and land management can't quite keep up with the volume that we're seeing for recreation, we suggest that based off of recent science and recent data, to make small changes to land management strategies, whether that be recreation permitting or reservations, or thinking of new ways to protect wildlife at vulnerable times of the year and vulnerable places, and then still accommodate a whole range of recreation experiences for people and the public. And I think the adaptive word there is pretty critical. I always bring up the metaphor of like, try something on for size, and if it doesn't work, try again. And so the adaptive element within this suggestion, I think, will kind of lead the charge into finding workable and pragmatic solutions. So the big question is kind of like, what does this mean for all of us who love our public lands, who love our flora and fauna, who love just being outside? We recommend that folks stick to designated trails where possible, just to be more predictable for wildlife, and particularly in critical wildlife habitat. That's just a great way to respect our landscape. Number two is try to do the majority of your recreation during the day. So a lot of these species that I've mentioned are more active at the dawn and dusk hours, and in between those hours on the back end as well. So whenever possible, if you can be more active during the day, that's kind of a great way to create a time buffer between you and wildlife. And this next one is kind of low-hanging fruit, but is certainly quite important, is to respect any seasonal or temporary restrictions or closures on public lands. And so we often see this in wintering areas designated for mule deer or designated for elk in various public lands, that the public land managers will often ask folks to stay out of areas for a few months out of the year to make sure that wildlife are undisturbed. As a rock climber myself, sometimes there are some restrictions for certain walls and mountains because there are nesting raptors on certain cliffs where rock climbs are. So that's another example of like a seasonal or temporary closure. So it's just important that we all respect those closures when they do come about in certain areas. Number four is consider consolidating your own recreation footprint. This comes out of the notion that animals just need time and space. And so to whatever extent that you feel comfortable, consider shrinking that footprint of recreation. And this is more of a philosophical kind of thing that we all can do, but is important nonetheless, is to be open and to engage in the process. And so I ask folks to be openness, to bring a sense of openness to discussions that require new changes to land management, and specifically recreation land management. We know that the status quo has severely changed since COVID-19 in terms of the numbers of folks that we have outside and the number of new folks that we have outside, which is a great thing, but has some implications for the sustainability of current management models. So we encourage you all to be, and myself included, we encourage everyone to be open to new ideas, and as well as engaging in the process. Because oftentimes these new management strategies are contingent on public engagement. And so maybe one example I'll lift up right now is over at Mount Rainier National Park. There's currently a process to figure out how to reduce overcrowding in the Nisqually to Paradise corridor. And so you can check out kind of the public engagement opportunities there at Mount Rainier National Park website. We also encourage y'all to advocate for land managers. There's often a need for capacity and often need for more funding to really manage this growing use of public lands. And then in the same vein, we ask that you advocate for wildlife. A great way to do that is to sign up for our e-newsletter. We often will engage our supporter base with opportunities to engage either at the legislative level or more kind of in the public sphere for ways to promote wildlife and restoration of wildlife all across the state. And this is a really important kind of lens to all this too, is to include and welcome other folks into the outdoors. I think there's an element of equity and inclusion within this conversation that is absolutely necessary to keep into the forefront of discussions, to make sure that kind of the new ways that we're managing lands keeps everyone at the table and welcomes people into a safe and respectful recreation experience. And then speaking of respectful and responsible recreation, we'd encourage folks to learn more about this topic. As I mentioned, a lot of the science is pretty new and it's ever evolving, and there's voices talking about this more than ever before, especially from a tribal perspective. And the Snoqualmie tribe, kind of over in the I-90 corridor area, if you're not familiar, launched in 2021 a Snoqualmie tribe's ancestral lands movement, kind of an educational campaign to bring a higher sense of respect and awareness to their very recreation heavy ancestral lands area. And so incorporating respectful practices or just more knowledge about the history of the landscape is a great way to bring a higher sense of respect to your recreation practices. And then the Tulalip tribes, just located to the north of where I am in Seattle, produced a report exactly on this subject in 2021, and that's called The Recreation Boom on Public Lands, kind of talking about a lot of the science and the implications through the lens of tribal treaty rights, and tribal treaty rights that more or less look like harvesting and land, or excuse me, harvesting resources on public lands off reservation. And so the outdoor recreation growth that we've seen in years past can come into conflict with those tribal treaty rights. So certainly many avenues to continue the conversation and to continue the learning. And so those are just some ways that we can all kind of be more conscientious of the fact that wildlife and recreation interact in complicated ways, and it has implications for us moving forward. So that's about kind of all that I have right now, folks. I have a QR code if you want to scan that to look at this literature report that I've been talking so heavily about, produced by Home Range Wildlife Research up in the Matt-Howe and Conservation Northwest. So there's certainly a lot of good information there. And I realized that I didn't quite sneak in any avian species in this report. I must have forgotten those slides. But there's certainly lots of information about those avian species in the report, as well as tons of more information on carnivores and ungulate species. So yeah, I've also listed my email if you want to get in contact with me and continue the conversation. Always happy to chat. But yeah, maybe at this point, I'll just press pause from my end and hear any responses or comments. Or yeah.
So Kirk, can you go ahead and stop sharing? And I really appreciated that. That was really, really excellent. I have about 5 questions of my own queued up, but I know there might be others. So let me start by saying I live out by where the Bolt Creek fire was. So I'm curious about the overlap between the fire recovery areas and this research, and curious if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, wildfire changes landscape drastically.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've been over to that area since the burn, but it looks like a moonscape, right? Like, and so with that said, that area will go through a series of succession restoration that'll see different types of species using that area more than other species that did previously. And then also the fauna, or excuse me, the flora that comes back will come into different stages as well, with various elements of delicacy within that. And so I think, you know, given that that area is burned in an area that has some heavy recreation use, I think land management of that particular area will have to be pretty keen to make sure that recreation doesn't billow out into new places that haven't been designated previously. But, you know, I would encourage you all to check out that area too and hike on designated trails, because I think some of those landscapes are pretty cool and gets you in touch with the whole life cycle of forest as well.
Yeah. Thanks. And then my other curiosity is regarding the grizzlies coming back into the Cascades. And I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more about that.
That's another perfect opportunity to engage in the process. So grizzly bear reintroduction in the North Cascades has been a multi-decade roller coaster of restarting the process to consider if they're viable in the North Cascades bear management area. Or so there's many elements to talk about in terms of North Cascades grizzly bears and them coming back. But I'll just mention right now that there's plenty of information out on our website, conservationnorthwest.org, or conservationnw.org rather. And we have a whole list of different grizzly bear resources and where we are in the process for the North Cascades. And just to maybe lift up one public engagement process right now, or we're about to head into, is a comment on the draft environmental impact statement. And this is done by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the National Park Service here in Washington. Well, that operates in Washington, but it has lands all over the nation. But I think in the next couple weeks here, if not in sometime in June, there'll be an opportunity for the entire public to engage on various documents and plans regarding reintroduction for that particular species in the North Cascades.
Hey Kurt, who takes all those pictures? You got I looked a little bit at the thing on the QR code, and then some pictures you added. You got some fabulous wildlife pictures. Are those yours or somebody else's, or?
It's so Conservation Northwest, we have a lot of amazing staff. Some of those are staff photos, and some of those are photos from various contractors that we worked with. And then some of those photos come from the Department of Fish and Wildlife here in Washington State. So we have a lot of biologists that work closely with us and various other parts of our work. And so we get those photos as a way to kind of amplify our work.
Well, again, the picture that lynx or those mountain lions, those are I've never seen one in live. So that strikes me as the whole issues are kind of territorial a lot. I think, is every time I go hiking, it seems like I get about a mile past the trailhead and everybody, the trail gets pretty empty. So a lot of what you're talking about seems like it would go to the more hardcore type of recreational user, as opposed to the casual person who just gets out on that well stomped on first mile of trail. And I suppose it all needs attention. And then it probably matters to it. It strikes me as whether you're talking urban Western Washington or Eastern Washington, probably a different set of issues. And then of course the mountain areas have different set of issues. And I'll say the shoreline has got another set of issues of, kind of similar, but it's different. Must be hard to get your hands around all of it, I would think.
Yeah, certainly. That's an astute observation there, Roger, that this stuff is certainly complex and it's locally specific oftentimes. Mm-hmm. And so with that said, it really necessitates local communities coming together to decide what's the best course of action. So like that local engagement piece and having everyone that's needed around the table that talk all this through is super, super important, because you're absolutely right. Conversations about shoreline versus out in Spokane are going to look very different when you're talking about balancing recreation with natural resource protections.
So speaking selfishly, I lost out on all three of the lotteries for backcountry. I did get one in the Olympic Peninsula, but I lost the Enchantments, I lost Rainier, I lost North Cascades. So I know I still have walk-up options, but do you envision more lotteries and stricter limits coming based on this research?
That's a really good question. I can't say one way or the other, but I think what we'll have more of is this adaptive management. And so where I see this going is, as we have more fine-tuned information about particular species of wildlife in particular areas of the state, we'll have a much more nuanced way to manage. And in one sense that I could see this really well playing out is backcountry skiing. And so if scientists can identify where exactly wolverines are denning near it, like year after year, they'll probably temporarily close that particular mountainside or mountain area, I don't know, to create that time and space that denning wolverine needs to produce viable young and not face disturbance from backcountry skiing. And so maybe more to your point, Marcy, about really popular stuff of finding lottery or getting lottery reservations for popular areas. Yeah, I hope that people can still get out in a lot of ways and experience all these amazing places. But I think given that the status quo is changed, we're just seeing more and more people more than ever before, we're going to have to be getting pretty creative to make sure that folks still have opportunities to get outside, but also we need to protect our natural, our cultural, in some cases, our tribal resources out in our public lands. And so I think there's certainly a tool belt and a range of different practices folks can implement. I'm sure that reservations and lotteries will continue to be part of that tool belt. But to the extent in which it'll go, I can't say for certain, but I think an adaptable framework will be super key, and we'll see a lot more of that in years to come.
Hey, Kurt.
Yeah.
I became aware of, I was shocked actually, when they allowed the wolves back in Yellowstone, and the impact on everything, more species of birds, more water resources. I mean, the impact, there are videos, and I wish I could remember all of it, but it was astonishing. And that same thing I can see being the issue in Washington as well. You know, the less people, the more you can, well, what am I trying to say here? The more wildlife you allow into an area, the healthier the land stays. And to manage all of that, plus a rise in tourism and that, I can just see it's really complex, to say it mildly.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. It's certainly complex, and maybe to bring in something Marcy mentioned previously is the North Cascades and grizzly bear reintroduction. And we're huge proponents of having more wildlife out in our landscapes, because yeah, it does mean a more healthy landscape to have more wildlife that particularly was there historically for thousands of years. So we're all about that. But you know, at the same vein, that's why we're doing this work and trying to be as proactive as possible about balancing recreation with outdoor recreation and tourism too. Like, and to that note, I think tourism folks need to be at the table at a lot of these discussions for how do we manage our lands more effectively for wildlife and for other natural resources. So we're all part of the problem, but we're definitely all a part of the solution. So that's the way that I see it right now.
Say, Kurt, does the Conservation Northwest take a look at urban wildlife? Like we've got, I mean, here in Magnolia, we hadn't had any coyotes till about, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And now they're pretty common, to the point where you better keep your kitty cat on a leash, sort of a thing. And you know, I mean, now that's not recreation running up against wildlife, but it's wildlife running up against what, urban living, I guess. Yeah. You know, is that part of what happens, or are you guys more toward the recreation in the mountain areas as non-urban areas?
So I'll say right now, Conservation Northwest does most of its work outside of strictly urban areas. But that's not to say that it couldn't be in our purview going forward. But I will key in a really great nonprofit and organization that does this work. I see Marcy just put it in the chat, is the Woodland Park Zoo. Talks tons and tons about carnivore and urban coexistence. So they have a great page specifically on coyotes and how we can coexist with them moving forward in our local parks or even our city streets. Because you're right, coyotes are everywhere. I was reading a book recently, and can't remember the author exactly, but everyone in the US of A lives within 1 square mile of a coyote. That's how prolific they are in the United States, at least. So it's certainly they're nearly ubiquitous out here. So we certainly have to find ways of coexisting with them effectively.
We're about 30 feet from coyotes. We're on a golf course here in Phoenix, and that's their runway. And we can hear them when they catch something. And none of them are skinny. And the rabbits are plentiful, but that's what feeds them. So it's like, you know, and you do not let your cat out at night. They'll sit on there. There's pictures of them sitting at stoplights, just waiting for the stoplight to change to cross the street. So yeah, that's the urban side of all this.
Okay, I'm just to do a check-in. Any last questions for Kurt? Let him go. Okay, Kurt, I want to say thank you so much for coming tonight. Great presentation, really, really good content. And I'll thank you on behalf of the folks on the line and the folks who are waiting for the recording. So thank you for coming tonight. And I'll let you all go. Good night,
Well, thanks so much, everyone.
everybody.
Pleasure to be
Thank you,
here with
Kurt.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kurt.